This is a live map of ships at sea. Looking at it, you'd think we can see everything happening across the world's oceans, but the truth is there are still places that remain a mystery. Take a look at this spot here. These are the Galapagos Islands. And if you check the same marine traffic map, there are barely any ships around them. But that's misleading. In fact, more than 100 vessels are near the islands right now. They just don't show up on the map. They can appear and disappear over and over. It seems strange, but the same thing happens in many parts of the ocean. While you're watching this video, ghost ships are moving off the coasts of Africa and South America. They're here, and right here, and no one can see them. So what are these ships doing? And more importantly, why aren't they on the map? You're about to find out. Let's start with the obvious question. Why do we see all these ships on online maps in the first place? And how can some of them simply vanish? All those thousands of dots on the map are not leaks from secret databases. We can see them because ships use a system called AIS, or the Automatic Identification System. In simple terms, it's basically a chat system for vessels, a tanker sailing along and constantly broadcasting messages that basically say, "Here I am, this is where I'm going, this is my speed, and these are my coordinates." It's a non-stop stream of status updates and data shared with other ships, coastal stations, and satellites. And what's it for? Well, obviously not for you and me. The whole point of the system is to keep two massive steel giants from crashing into each other in the middle of the sea. A captain's not looking at some abstract dot on a screen, but at a specific tanker with a name and a full set of details. Convenient? Absolutely. What's more, this is not some optional feature you can use if you feel like it. It's a requirement of the International Maritime Organization. If you want to operate on international routes, you're expected to keep your AIS on. And now here's where it gets interesting. Because despite all those rules, shutting the system off is not difficult at all. No hackers required. Sometimes all it takes is flipping a switch, or making a couple of clicks in the navigation system, and that's it. The vessel disappears. One moment it's there, the next it's gone. To outside observers, it turns into a ghost ship, or in more professional terms, a shadow vessel. So does that mean ships from all kinds of countries really can just disappear from the map and do things at sea without anyone seeing them? Yes, exactly. But according to research, one country has become better at this than anyone else: China. Investigations show that the country has what's essentially a true long-range maritime fleet that, as of 2026, includes up to 17,000 vessels. To put that in perspective, that's several times larger than the combined fleets of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Spain. And a huge number of those ships regularly go dark by switching off their AIS systems. And now we get to the main question. Why would China do this? Well, one major reason is resource extraction. These are the Galapagos Islands, home to one of the richest fishing grounds in the ocean. The water here is absolutely teeming with life. Dense schools of fish, migrating shoals, non-stop movement everywhere. And that's no accident. This is the point where major currents collide, constantly pushing nutrient-rich water up from the depths. But the real prize here is squid like these. They're exactly why, night after night, hundreds of Chinese ghost ships come to these waters. They shine bright lights into the water, and squid are exactly the kind of creatures that swim in huge schools and easily fall for that trick. So once the squid gather under the lights, the crews simply haul them aboard. It's a fairly easy catch. But wait, do you really need to be a ghost ship to catch squid? After all, squid don't exactly check who's fishing for them. True, but the problem is that they're not swimming in places where Chinese vessels can legally fish without consequences. Under international rules, Ecuador, which controls the Galapagos, has a 124-mile exclusive economic zone around the islands. If a Chinese vessel is caught fishing for squid inside that zone, it's not just a routine violation, it's a major scandal. There are also international waters beyond the exclusive zone where fishing is allowed. The problem is that squid don't care for human boundaries, and they're mostly concentrated inside the Galapagos protected zone. So how does switching off AIS help Chinese vessels in this situation? Very simply. When a Chinese fishing vessel reaches the 200-mile boundary of Ecuador's exclusive economic zone, it just shuts the system off. At that moment, it disappears from the Coast Guard screens. While patrol boats are searching the open ocean, the vessel can slip farther inside the zone at low speed, where squid concentrations are much higher. Once its holds are full, the ship heads back into international waters and switches AIS back on. From the outside, it looks as if the vessel was simply sitting still or slowly drifting outside Ecuador's zone the whole time. So how often do Chinese ghost ships pull this off? According to multiple investigations, very often. In 2020, Oceania tracked around 300 Chinese fishing vessels near the islands at the same time. 300! And in just 1 month, they logged more than 73,000 hours of fishing activity. After that, the numbers only kept rising. From 2021 to 2023, the same Oceania investigation counted 510 vessels. That's more than any other country operating in the area, and the total time spent fishing for squid around the Galapagos climbed to 134,000 hours. At some point, a pretty obvious question comes up. Do Chinese vessels not realize there's already enormous scrutiny around squid fishing near the Galapagos? Why not go after the same catch somewhere else? Well, actually they do. And they do it in a lot of other places too. Chinese vessels are regularly spotted off the coasts of Peru and Chile. And they also form a long chain along Argentina's shoreline. And these are not one-off situations. This is a consistent, ongoing pattern. Take northern Chile, for example, Iquique region. According to reports from local maritime authorities, about 229 vessels were operating there in 2025 alone. And yes, the overwhelming majority were Chinese. They were all doing the same thing, fishing for squid. Now let's move farther south, toward Argentina, and the scale becomes even more striking. According to Oceania, from 2018 to 2021, hundreds of foreign fishing vessels were operating along the edge of Argentine waters. And once again, most of them were Chinese. So can governments really do nothing about this? Seriously, there have to be cases where they practically catch them red-handed. There's the vessel, there's the fishing, and it's happening inside an exclusive economic zone. Where's the leverage? On paper, it all looks simple. Any foreign vessel that enters an exclusive economic zone can be stopped, inspected, fined, and sometimes even seized. It sounds like a system that should work, but in reality, it breaks down, and almost immediately. Because most of this activity doesn't happen clearly inside the zone, it happens right along the edge, or completely outside it, and out there, the rules change. In international waters, a vessel falls under the jurisdiction of the flag state alone. Whatever flag it sails under, that country's the one responsible for dealing with it. And if that flag is Chinese, then Ecuador, Peru, Chile, or any other country has very little power to intervene. Fine, maybe they don't catch them in the act, but can't they track them afterward? The catch has to go somewhere. Couldn't ports be warned, sails be blocked, alarms raised? Sounds reasonable. But no, that usually doesn't work either, because the whole system is designed to leave as little trace as possible. These ghost vessels almost never enter port carrying their catch. They can drift around the ocean for months, repeating the same cycle, arrive at the fishing grounds, switch off AIS, do the job, then move away. Later, they turn it back on somewhere else as if nothing happened, over and over again. Which raises the obvious question, then who actually transports the catch? Roughly 20 to 30 miles beyond the borders of these exclusive economic zones, huge refrigerated cargo vessels, known as reefers, wait offshore. They're just there, waiting for the right moment. At night, smaller fishing boats approach them with no lights on, often with their identification systems completely shut down. Then the transfer begins. Tons of squid are moved onto the reefer. In return, the fishing boats receive fuel, food, and whatever else they need to stay at sea for months without ever entering port. And that's it. That's where the trail gets cold. Because from that point on, it's the reefer that carries the cargo to port. And on paper, that squid is suddenly legitimate, supposedly caught on the high seas. You'd think the scheme couldn't get any more sophisticated. But no, there's another layer. Many investigations also uncover the issue of flags of convenience. That means the vessel's not even legally Chinese. It's registered in another country, usually one where oversight is weak or mostly just a formality. So the situation becomes bizarre. One country on the paperwork, another nationality in the crew, and owners based somewhere else entirely. Responsibility is spread across jurisdictions, and figuring out who's really behind it becomes almost impossible. And that brings me to another question. How do the sailors on these ghost vessels feel about all this? They can see what's happening. Doesn't anyone refuse, quit, or speak out? In reality, that's hardly even an option. A lot of investigations show the same thing. Life on these vessels isn't a job you can simply walk away from. It's much closer to a floating prison. In many cases, people end up on these vessels not because they want to take part in shady operations. The reality is much more ordinary. They're simply looking for work. They're promised decent pay, a stable contract, and a routine voyage. Sounds like a chance to escape their situation. But that's where the first trap appears: debt. They have to pay for paperwork, for middlemen, for a spot on the vessel, so by the time they leave shore, they're already carrying an obligation to work it off. In other words, they've not even started the job yet, but they're already in debt. Then comes the isolation. According to multiple investigations, sailors often have their documents taken away and their communication restricted. Meanwhile, the vessels may not enter port for months at a time and sometimes for years. That's possible because of transshipment at sea. The ship has no need to come back, and at that point, any real choice is gone. You can't leave when there's nothing around you but water. You can't switch jobs. You can't even simply say, "I don't want to do this anymore." So people spend months, sometimes longer, traveling the same route over and over again. From the Galapagos Islands to Chile to Argentina, over and over, no breaks. And even that's not the whole story. Investigations have repeatedly documented systemic problems. Wages may not be paid at all, or they may be withheld until the very end of the voyage. You'd think at least the basics, food and water, would be provided. Not always. Investigations from 2013 to 2025 recorded cases where workers literally did not have enough food. But even that was not the worst part. They didn't have enough water. Plain drinking water. From the outside, it looks like a perfectly organized system. A huge fleet, precise routes, efficient logistics, but inside are people who control almost nothing. Not the route, not the conditions, not even how long they're supposedly out at sea. And here, if I step back from all this for a second, another question comes to mind. Did China really focus only on squid? Were its so-called ghost vessels not fishing for anything else? That sounds strange. What could be the reason for that? In reality, there is none. Because investigation after investigation says it plainly, China's ghost fleet catches fish too. And in those cases, the schemes become even more elaborate. So now let's move to Africa, to Ghana. There are tons of fishing vessels operating in this country's waters, and on paper, everything looks perfectly legitimate. They're all registered as Ghanaian. Not a word about China. Officially, everything appears to comply with the law. Foreign companies are barred from directly owning medium or large fishing vessels. Those are supposed to belong only to local owners. You check the registry, and that's exactly what you see. But then you get to what investigators call paper masking. According to the Environmental Justice Foundation, or EJF, as many as 90% of these vessels are actually controlled by Chinese companies. The same pattern shows up in Senegal, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. Essentially, much of Western Africa's coastline has seen a heavy presence of fleets tied to China. So maybe that at least means China's catching fish more or less openly and officially? According to reports from multiple organizations, that's not the case. In Ghana, for example, there's evidence of so-called Seiko fishing. That's where large trawlers transfer their catch directly at sea to small boats, which then sell the fish at local markets with no reporting, no oversight, and completely outside the legal system. In 2017 alone, that shadow catch amounted to as much as about 100,000 tons of fish. Another example of illegal fishing takes us much closer to China, off the coast of North Korea. One of the largest operations of its kind was observed. Satellite data detected hundreds of Chinese trawlers catching Pacific soray, a commercially valuable fish used for processing and export. Most of these vessels had their AIS systems turned off, effectively vanishing from tracking systems and creating a kind of invisibility. Researchers from Global Fishing Watch estimated that in 2017, those ships caught hundreds of thousands of tons of fish worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But that's still not the strangest thing these ghost vessels have been doing. After interviewing 88 crew members from Chinese fishing vessels, researchers found that more than 95% said they'd been involved in shark fishing. Many also describe shark finning, the practice of slicing off a shark's fins and dumping the rest of the animal back into the sea. And there's one particularly telling example that shows just how large-scale this activity can be. In 2017, a Chinese vessel was detained near the Galapagos Islands. When authorities inspected it, they found more than 6,600 shark carcasses, including rare species such as hammerhead sharks. Many of them were missing their fins. The total weight exceeded 300 tons. It was one of the largest seizures of protected marine animals in the region. And that was just one ship. Think that was the end of it? Unfortunately, no. There have also been documented cases of Chinese vessels in Somali waters catching virtually everything in sight: orcas, dolphins, and turtles. These are species protected under both local law and international agreements. And this is where the scale becomes truly staggering. At that point, it's clear this activity is causing real environmental damage. But how badly is it harming other countries? Very badly. Let's start with West Africa, where you don't need charts or graphs to see the damage. You just walk out to the shore, take one look around, and realize something has gone deeply wrong. In Senegal, fish was the foundation of life for decades. It provided food, income, and in many ways, the rhythm of everyday existence. For generations, people went out to sea and came back with a catch. Then, large industrial fishing fleets moved into these waters, and the pressure became so intense that the ecosystem simply could not take it. According to independent experts, about 57% of the country's key fish stocks are now in a state of collapse. That doesn't mean there's just a little less fish than before. It means familiar species are disappearing on a scale people would have found unthinkable just 10 to 15 years ago. And from there, the chain reaction begins. People who spent their entire lives fishing off their own coast suddenly come back empty-handed, day after day, week after week. At some point, it becomes painfully clear that they can no longer live this way. Some leave for the cities. Some take whatever work they can find. And some make the most dangerous choice of all, trying to reach Europe. Many of them say it outright. The reason is that the fish are gone. Are people really not angry enough to protest? They are. And that's especially clear in Gambia. Local fishermen there don't go out to sea just to make a catch. They go out determined to defend their waters. When industrial trawlers come too close to shore, protests erupt, routes are blocked, clashes break out, and in some cases, boats have even been set on fire. Looking at the broader picture across West Africa, the situation becomes even more alarming. Analysts estimate that pressure from foreign industrial fishing fleets, including ones linked to Chinese companies, have wiped out more than 300,000 jobs in traditional fishing. And those are only the official estimates. Behind those numbers are real people, real families, and entire coastal communities. So let's think about that for a second. If this industry involves fishing on such a massive scale, complicated schemes, constant danger, and brutal conditions on board, then why doesn't China focus more on fishing closer to its own shores? Seriously, just look at the country's coastline. It's enormous, more than 11,000 miles long. So why spend billions on fuel and send fishing vessels all the way to the waters off Africa and South America? The answer is that behind the glossy image of the world's biggest economy lies an environmental disaster. China has essentially exhausted its own seas. Over the past 50 years, coastal resources have been exploited so aggressively that populations of many commercial species have fallen by 80 to 90%. In recent years, the situation's become almost absurd. In places like the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea, going out to fish is often no longer profitable. Fuel and operating costs can be higher than the value of the catch itself, and that's only part of the problem. For decades, waste from thousands of factories was discharged into coastal waters. The result has been recurring red tides, when toxic algae blooms spread and effectively wipe out marine life. So why is China not doing anything about it? Actually, it is. For example, the government introduced strict restrictions, including a 10-year fishing ban on the Yangtze, and there are already faint signs of recovery. But the problem is that the ocean's not a machine. You can't just switch it off and turn it back on again. Recovery will take decades. Businesses need to make money now, and the country still needs seafood and fish right now, too. When there's nothing left at home, the fleet goes where the fish still are. Okay, all that makes sense, but is any of this connected to consumer habits? Yes, and in a pretty strange way. China is the leader in aquaculture. An enormous share of its fish is farm-raised, and yet consumers increasingly want wild-caught fish instead. Why? Because they don't trust farmed seafood. Scandals involving antibiotics, hormones, and feed quality have fueled demand for products seen as coming from the clean ocean, and that creates a vicious cycle. Fish farms need fish meal, and fish meal is made from small fish, the same kind that so-called ghost vessels are catching in huge quantities off the coast of Africa. So this is what it all comes down to. China has a population of nearly 1.5 billion people, and this is the coastline it has to work with. Even if its coastal waters were in perfect condition, the country still would not be able to fully feed itself. Put simply, using shadow fleets is a matter of necessity. But is there any real chance that the situation with China's so-called ghost fleet could change? Could governments or international organizations do more to monitor and control it? The Shadow Fleet's main weapon is switching off AIS. Turn it off, and it's almost like the vessel disappears. But here's the catch. That's no longer a panacea. Technology is caught up, and the rules of the game have changed. For example, companies like Hawkeye 360 have learned to detect vessels in a completely different way, not by their coordinates, but by their own electronic noise, because a ship's not exactly a silent machine. Even with AIS turned off, a vessel is still running radar, satellite communications, and onboard radios. All that gives off signals, and hiding them is almost impossible. Satellites can simply listen to the ocean, pick up those signals, and pinpoint a vessel's location within a few hundred feet. But could this fleet simply be cut off financially through international trade bodies? That's where things get really interesting, because that process has already begun. In June 2022, members of the World Trade Organization, including China, signed the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. It was a landmark deal. For the first time, it explicitly banned government support for vessels involved in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And here's the key point. China's distant water fleet depends heavily on subsidies. Fuel, maintenance, and even the ability to operate thousands of miles from home are all partly backed by the state. So if this agreement's ever enforced for real, many of those voyages could simply stop making economic sense. Sounds like a turning point, right? But there is a catch. On paper, the tools are finally taking shape. In reality, things are far more complicated. Because, judging by investigative reports, nothing is stopped overnight. Chinese ghost ships are still showing up off the coasts of different countries just as they were before.